What if everything you were taught about how America was conquered left out the real power behind the story? What if kings and crowns weren't the driving force, but companies? In the late 1500s and early 1600s, long before the United States existed, long before the word patriot or revolution meant anything on this soil, deals were being signed in quiet rooms thousands of miles away across the Atlantic. These weren't royal war councils. They were investor meetings. Wealthy merchants and aristocrats gathered around polished wooden tables, eyes fixed on maps of lands they'd never set foot on. They spoke not of liberty or civilization, but of risk, profit, and return on investment. To them, North America wasn't a land of nations and peoples. It was a ledger line, a resource pool, a blank page on which to write fortunes. And what followed wasn't a national conquest in the way we often imagine it, with armies, flags, and national mandates, but something colder, more calculated, and far more enduring. It was a corporate conquest built on charters, monopolies, and venture capital. Before the first settlers stepped off their ships, companies were already carving up the continent on paper. Before the first shot was fired, the wealth of the land was already spoken for in boardrooms. This is the untold story of how corporations, not just governments, conquered America. And to understand it, we have to follow the money, back to the moment when the New World became a business plan. To understand how corporations conquered America, we have to step back to a time when empires were broke. By the late 16th century, European monarchs had imperial ambitions but limited funds. Exploration, colonization, and military occupation required enormous wealth. Maintaining fleets, supplying soldiers, building settlements, defending trade routes, all of this was expensive beyond the means of any single royal treasury. So monarchs turned to private capital. The solution they found would change history: joint stock companies. In these companies, merchants, nobles, and investors pooled their money into large commercial ventures. The Crown issued charters, granting these companies exclusive rights to claim and control overseas territories. The arrangement was simple and devastatingly effective. The Crown took almost none of the financial risk but gained prestige, territory, and influence. The investors took on the risk but stood to reap massive profits. In 1606, one of the most famous of these ventures was born, the Virginia Company of London. It wasn't a government agency, it was a for-profit corporation. Its purpose wasn't to build a democracy or plant a flag in the name of the Crown. Its purpose was to make money. The company was given a royal charter, granting it authority over large sections of North America. That charter didn't just allow it to trade, it allowed it to govern. It could raise militias, enforce laws, administer justice, and claim land. Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America, was not a national project. It was a corporate outpost. The settlers who arrived weren't pioneers representing the British people. They were employees, indentured workers, or private contractors representing a commercial venture. This same model would be repeated again and again. The Massachusetts Bay Company would bring Puritans to New England with a charter that allowed them to establish their own self-governing corporate colony. The Dutch West India Company, backed by wealthy Amsterdam merchants, would seize and control what is now New York. The Hudson's Bay Company would control an area larger than Western Europe. In each case, the pattern was the same. The state provided the legal framework, but the companies did the conquering, the governing, and the profiting. The story of America doesn't begin with the government planting a flag on the shore. It begins with a company filing a charter. The Virginia Company's early years were brutal. The men who came over were mostly unprepared for the reality of the land they had claimed. They arrived dreaming of gold mines and easy riches. Instead, they found a swamp. Food was scarce, disease spread rapidly, and indigenous resistance limited their expansion. Within the first year, a staggering number of settlers died. Investors back in London were on the verge of pulling out. But then everything changed with one plant: tobacco. John Rolfe's introduction of a sweet strain of tobacco turned a failing outpost into a gold rush. Europeans couldn't get enough of the stuff. Demand skyrocketed. Suddenly, Virginia wasn't just viable, it was profitable. But tobacco is a labor-intensive crop. The company needed workers, and it needed them fast. It began offering indentured servitude contracts. Young men and women from England, Ireland, and Scotland could sign away years of their lives in exchange for passage to the New World and the vague promise of land at the end of their term. In reality, most never saw that land. Many died in the fields, victims of malnutrition, disease, or overwork. Their contracts were traded like assets. They weren't citizens, they were labor investments. And as the demand for labor grew beyond what indentured servants could supply, the company turned to a new system: African slavery. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, and the corporate colony fused itself to slavery as an economic engine. It wasn't an unfortunate moral lapse. It was a cold calculation. Enslaved labor meant higher profit margins. Plantations expanded, tobacco flowed, and investors got rich, many of them without ever setting foot in the colony. The economic logic was simple. The land was free because it had been stolen. The labor was cheap because it was coerced, and the profits were enormous. This is where the foundation of America's plantation economy was built, not by governments, but by companies seeking returns. The colony didn't grow organically. It was engineered to maximize extraction. This logic, to take land, extract value, and convert people into assets, would echo through centuries of American expansion. When corporate charters were written, they didn't see the land as home to living nations. They saw it as territory to be divided, mapped, and sold. But the continent was not empty. The Powhatan Confederacy, the Wampanoag, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, the Massachusetts, the Abenaki, the Narragansett, and hundreds of other indigenous nations had governed, traded, farmed, and thrived here for generations. They had cities, agriculture, diplomacy, and economies far older than the companies that claimed their homelands. But European legal doctrine, wrapped in words like terra nullius, vacant land, and vacuum domicilium, declared any land not used in a European way to be empty. This legal fiction gave corporate charters a blank check to claim vast territories. Investors in London claimed rivers and forests they'd never seen. They sold shares of land to people who didn't even know where the land was. And when indigenous nations resisted these claims, the companies treated resistance as a business problem to be solved with violence. Corporate colonies raised militias. They requested royal troops. They signed treaties that were designed not to share land, but to legalize its theft. Many treaties were signed under duress, mistranslated, or simply fabricated. Entire wars, like the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, were fought not over national ideology, but over corporate land interests. Every acre cleared meant more tobacco, more timber, more trade, more dividends. Colonists pushed indigenous nations back, not just for survival, but to increase returns. And as the corporate frontier expanded, it laid down a pattern. Indigenous land would be declared empty, seized, parceled, and sold. The human presence, the sovereignty, the cultures that existed on that land were erased from the paperwork before they were erased from the land itself. The conquest of America was written in contracts before it was written in blood. What made corporate colonization unique was not just the land grabs, but the power companies wielded. The Virginia Company didn't just trade, it ruled. It had its own councils, governors, and courts. It established laws, collected taxes, and punished dissent. It functioned as a government because, in practice, it was one. The Massachusetts Bay Company ruled Puritan New England with a fusion of religious doctrine and corporate control. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, would become one of the most powerful corporate entities in world history. It controlled a territory larger than Western Europe. It had its own private military, negotiated treaties, enforced its own legal system, and flew its own flag. For 2 centuries, it acted as a sovereign power over indigenous lands in what is now Canada. The Dutch West India Company and Dutch East India Company operated similarly, building forts, commanding fleets, waging wars, and enslaving people, all as corporate ventures. This was not a minor footnote in history. It was the dominant structure of early colonization. And because these entities answered to shareholders, not citizens, their priorities were different from any modern government. They didn't have to justify their actions to voters. They only had to deliver profits. Their colonies were structured like extractive machines, optimized for resource flow, not human rights. The laws they wrote protected property above all else. Indigenous nations, indentured servants, and enslaved Africans had no voice. These were corporate kingdoms, answerable only to investors. The American Revolution is remembered as a revolt against a tyrannical king, but it was also a revolt against monopolies. The Boston Tea Party wasn't simply about taxes. It was about colonists being forced to buy tea exclusively from the British East India Company. They weren't just defying Britain, they were defying a corporate monopoly backed by the state. But after independence, the system didn't disappear. It evolved. Land companies like the Ohio Company rushed to seize indigenous land in the West, speculating and selling before treaties were even signed. The new U.S. government often acted less like a neutral authority and more like a broker for corporate interests. In the 19th century, railroad corporations became the new empire builders. The government granted them tens of millions of acres of indigenous land. They built company towns where everything, homes, stores, wages, and even law enforcement, was controlled by the corporation. Indigenous nations were pushed off their lands to make way for the tracks. Entire communities were uprooted or destroyed to clear the way for progress. The Dawes Act of 1887 fragmented communal indigenous lands, allowing speculators and corporations to buy them up at rock-bottom prices. Timber, mining, and oil companies followed, carving the continent into zones of extraction. The logic of the Virginia Company had become the logic of the nation itself. Seize land, control labor, extract wealth, and consolidate power. For centuries, the popular narrative of American history has been told as a story of nations, flags, and ideals. But beneath that surface lies the deeper truth. Corporations were here first. The Virginia Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Dutch West India Company. These weren't background actors in history. They were the directors. They shaped how land was taken, how people were governed, and how wealth flowed. They built a system where profit came before people, and where sovereignty could be erased with a signature. After the revolution, that system didn't end. It just changed clothes. Land companies, railroads, mining firms, and oil barons picked up where the charter companies left off. Indigenous nations continued to face dispossession, workers continued to face exploitation, and corporations continued to wield enormous power over the land and its people. Even today, echoes of this history are everywhere, in pipeline battles, in corporate control of natural resources, in how development continues to consume ancestral lands. The conquest of America wasn't just a military campaign. It was a business model, and that business model became the blueprint for expansion, wealth, and power in the modern United States. To understand American history fully, we have to look beyond the governments and follow the money, because the companies that conquered the land also built the system we live in now. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.